The ancient stones of Westminster Abbey had witnessed many coronations, but perhaps none quite like this one. As King Charles III sat in the golden throne of his ancestors on that spring day in 2023, the weight of history pressed down upon his shoulders like a crown made of centuries. He was now the head of the Church of England, the supreme governor of a religious institution born from one of history's most dramatic breaks with Rome. Yet even as the Archbishop of Canterbury placed the St. Edward's crown upon his head, Charles carried within his heart a vision that would have shocked his Tudor predecessors. He dreamed not of maintaining the ancient divide between Canterbury and Rome, but of building bridges across the chasm that Henry VIII had carved in 1534. This was a monarch who had spent decades studying world religions, who had privately met with Pope Francis just months before the pontiff's death, and who believed that the modern world needed unity, not division. The seeds of this historic moment had been planted years earlier. Charles was not like the kings before him. Where Henry VIII had raged against papal authority, Charles spoke quietly of interfaith dialogue. Where previous monarchs had maintained strict Protestant protocols, Charles had attended the canonization of Cardinal John Henry Newman in 2019, sitting respectfully in the pews of St. Peter's Basilica, as Pope Francis declared the Anglican convert a saint. Those who knew the king well were not surprised by his spiritual curiosity. As Prince of Wales, he had studied Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism with genuine interest. He had met with religious leaders from across the spectrum, always seeking common ground rather than emphasizing differences. His friends spoke of a man who prayed regularly, who found deep meaning in ancient rituals, and who believed that God spoke through many traditions. But it was his relationship with environmental conservation that would ultimately provide the bridge to Rome. Charles had been speaking about climate change since the 1970s, long before it became fashionable or politically urgent. He saw the destruction of God's creation as a spiritual crisis, not merely a scientific one. When Pope Francis published his environmental encyclical Laudato Si in 2015, Charles found in the Argentine pontiff a kindred spirit who shared his vision of humanity's sacred duty to protect the earth. The conversations between Buckingham Palace and the Vatican had been delicate and discreet. No one wanted to appear to be undoing the Reformation, yet both sides recognized the symbolism and power of reconciliation. When Pope Leo XIV was elected in May 2025, following the unexpected death of Pope Francis, Charles saw an opportunity. The new American-born pope was young, dynamic, and openly committed to healing historical wounds between Christian denominations. The planning took months. Every detail had to be perfect, every symbol carefully chosen to respect both traditions while breaking new ground. The Sistine Chapel, perhaps the most sacred space in all of Catholicism, would host the unprecedented gathering. Beneath Michelangelo's immortal frescoes, the head of the Church of England and the Bishop of Rome would kneel together in prayer for the first time since the English Reformation. Charles understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. His private secretary had briefed him on the historical significance. No reigning British monarch had publicly worshipped with a pope since 1534. The political ramifications were enormous, the religious implications even greater. Conservative Protestants in Britain were already expressing concern, while progressive Catholics saw it as a sign of hope for eventual reunification. Yet as Charles prepared for the journey to Rome, he felt not anxiety, but peace. This was not about politics or publicity. This was about healing wounds that had festered for nearly 500 years. It was about showing the world that faith could unite rather than divide, that ancient enemies could become modern friends. The king's closest advisors had worried about the optics. Would this make him appear to be abandoning his Protestant heritage? Would it undermine his role as supreme governor of the Church of England? But Charles had been clear. He was not betraying his Anglican identity. He was expanding it. He was showing that strength lay not in isolation, but in dialogue, not in fear, but in faith. As his plane lifted off from London on that crisp October evening in 2025, Charles gazed down at the lights of the city below. Somewhere in those glowing streets were the descendants of those who had cheered Henry VIII break with Rome, and those who had mourned it. Tomorrow, their king would do something that would have seemed impossible to any of them. He would kneel in prayer beside the Pope, asking God's blessing on a broken world that desperately needed to see that healing was possible. The journey to Rome was about to begin, but the real journey, the one toward reconciliation and understanding, had been 5 centuries in the making. Now, finally, it was time to complete it. Hashtag the arrival in the eternal city. The wheels of the royal aircraft touched down on Roman soil as the sun was setting over the 7 hills, painting the ancient city in shades of gold and amber. King Charles gazed out the window at the sprawling metropolis that had once been the heart of an empire and was now the spiritual center of over 1 billion Catholics worldwide. Somewhere in that maze of medieval streets and Baroque churches, Pope Leo XIV was waiting to make history. Queen Camilla sat beside her husband, her own thoughts racing. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, the personal significance of this moment for Charles. Her family had strong Catholic connections, and she had watched her husband struggle for years with the rigid boundaries between Christian denominations. Tonight, those boundaries would begin to blur in ways that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier. The royal couple was whisked through Rome's chaotic traffic in their armored Bentley, the famous Bentley state limousine that had carried them to countless state functions. But this journey felt different. As they passed the ancient Colosseum, lit dramatically against the darkening sky, Charles reflected on how this city had witnessed the persecution of early Christians, their transformation into the official religion of the empire, and eventually the great schisms that had split Christianity into countless fragments. Tomorrow, in a small way, some of that fragmentation might begin to heal. Their hotel was elegant but understated. Charles had insisted on keeping the visit as spiritual as possible, avoiding the pomp and ceremony that often overshadowed the deeper meaning of such encounters. That evening, he spent hours in prayer and meditation, reading from both the Book of Common Prayer and selected writings of previous popes who had worked toward Christian unity. The weight of the next day's events pressed heavily upon his mind. Meanwhile, across the city in the Apostolic Palace, Pope Leo XIV was having his own moment of profound reflection. At 58 years old, the former Archbishop of Chicago was still adjusting to the enormous responsibility of leading the Catholic Church. Born Robert Prevost to Irish-American parents, he had taken the name Leo in honor of Pope Leo the Great, who had helped save Rome from barbarian invasion. Now he faced a different kind of challenge, healing wounds that had divided Christianity for centuries. Leo had met with his closest advisors throughout the evening. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, had briefed him extensively on the protocols and potential pitfalls of the encounter. Archbishop Flavio Pace, Secretary of the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity, had provided historical context that made the moment's significance even more overwhelming. Never before had a reigning British monarch publicly worshipped with a pope. The closest had been Queen Elizabeth II's formal visit to Pope John XXI in 1961, but that had been a diplomatic meeting, not a religious service. The Pope's private chapel, where he said his evening prayers, seemed especially peaceful that night. Leo knelt before a simple wooden crucifix and prayed for wisdom for guidance and for the grace to say and do the right things on this historic day. He thought about the centuries of misunderstanding, conflict, and even bloodshed that had separated Rome from Canterbury. He thought about the faithful on both sides who had yearned for reconciliation. And he thought about Jesus' own prayer that his followers would be one, as he and the Father were one. The next morning dawned clear and crisp over Rome. Charles awoke before sunrise, as was his custom, and spent an hour in private prayer. He read from the Gospel of John, focusing on Jesus' words about the unity of believers. The irony was not lost on him that these same scriptures had been quoted by both sides during the bitter divisions of the Reformation. Today, perhaps, they might serve to bring healing instead of conflict. The king's morning routine was precise and calming. He reviewed his notes for the day, checked with his private secretary about final arrangements, and spoke briefly with the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was supporting the visit from London despite some reservations from conservative church members. The Archbishop reminded Charles that he was acting not just as a monarch, but as the supreme governor of the Church of England. Every word, every gesture would be scrutinized for meaning. As Charles dressed in his morning coat and prepared for the short journey to the Vatican, he felt a deep sense of purpose. This was not about grand gestures or media attention. This was about doing what he believed God was calling him to do, to be a peacemaker, a bridge builder, a healer of ancient wounds. The Vatican awakened to unprecedented security arrangements. Swiss guards in their colorful Renaissance uniforms took their positions alongside modern security personnel. The world's media had gathered in numbers not seen since a papal funeral or election. Cardinals, bishops, and church officials from around the globe had requested permission to witness this historic moment. Pope Leo celebrated his private morning mass with special intentionality, offering prayers for the success of the day's events. He wore simple white vestments, eschewing elaborate ceremonial garb in favor of humility and authenticity. His private secretary reminded him of the schedule. First, a private meeting with the royal couple in the papal library, then the exchange of gifts and honors, and finally, the unprecedented prayer service in the Sistine Chapel. As the morning progressed and the moment of meeting approached, both leaders felt the weight of history settling upon their shoulders. They were about to do something that no pope and British monarch had done in nearly 500 years. They were about to show the world that divisions could be healed, that ancient enemies could become friends, and that faith could be a source of unity rather than conflict. The stage was set, the players were ready, and history was holding its breath. Hashtag the meeting of two worlds. The San Damaso courtyard of the Apostolic Palace had never hosted a scene quite like this one. As the royal Bentley rolled through the massive bronze doors and into the heart of Vatican City, dozens of Swiss guards in their Renaissance uniforms snapped to attention. Their halberds gleamed in the October morning light as they formed an honor guard unlike any other in the world. This was not just pageantry. This was history preparing to write itself. King Charles stepped from the vehicle first, his bearing dignified but warm. He wore a perfectly tailored morning coat, his medals catching the sunlight as he moved with the practiced grace of a man who had spent decades in the public eye. Behind him, Queen Camilla emerged in an elegant cream-colored coat and hat, her presence adding a softness to the formal proceedings that photographers would later describe as maternal grace. The Vatican police band struck up the opening notes of God Save the King, the British national anthem echoing off the ancient walls in a moment that would have been unthinkable to the architect who designed this space 5 centuries ago. Then came the Vatican anthem, its Latin words rising into the clear Roman sky as two worlds met in harmonious music. Pope Leo XIV waited at the entrance to the Apostolic Palace, a slight but powerful figure in his simple white cassock and zacchetto. At 58, he was younger than the 76-year-old king, but both men carried themselves with the weight of enormous responsibility. As they approached each other across the courtyard, television cameras from around the world captured every step, every gesture, every expression. The moment they met was electric with historical significance. Charles, as tradition demanded, was the first to speak. "Your Holiness," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. "It is an honor beyond words to meet you on this sacred ground." Pope Leo, whose Chicago accent had softened during his years in Rome, but never entirely disappeared, replied with equal formality but unmistakable warmth. "Your Majesty, you are most welcome in the house of St. Peter. Today we write a new chapter in an ancient story." Their handshake lasted several seconds longer than protocol required, both men seeming to acknowledge the weight of the moment. Here were the leaders of two churches that had been bitter enemies for centuries, standing together in friendship and mutual respect. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. The procession into the palace was stately but intimate. Swiss guards lined the marble corridors as the Pope personally escorted his guests through halls hung with priceless Renaissance masterpieces. Charles paused occasionally to admire a particular painting or fresco, his deep appreciation for art and history evident in his careful attention. Pope Leo served as an informed guide, pointing out works by Raphael and other masters with the enthusiasm of someone who never tired of sharing beauty with others. They passed through rooms where popes had made decisions that shaped the world, where emperors had knelt in submission, where the great questions of faith and politics had been debated for centuries. Each step took them deeper into the heart of Catholic authority. Yet Charles showed no discomfort, no sense of being on foreign ground. This was, his demeanor suggested, simply one house of God welcoming visitors from another. The papal library, their destination, was a masterpiece of Baroque design. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves contained some of the world's most precious manuscripts, while frescoed ceilings depicted scenes from church history. It was here, in this sanctuary of learning and prayer, that the real conversation would begin. As they settled into chairs arranged around a small table, both leaders seemed to relax slightly. The formal part of the meeting could begin, but first there were the human moments that would not be recorded by the cameras or noted in the official transcripts. Pope Leo inquired about the king's health, knowing that Charles had recently faced cancer treatment with characteristic dignity and courage. Charles, in turn, asked about the Pope's adjustment to his new role, understanding better than most the challenges of inheriting enormous responsibility late in life. The conversation flowed naturally from personal to profound. They spoke of their shared concern for the environment, the crisis facing God's creation in an age of climate change. Charles had been advocating for environmental protection since the 1970s, long before it was fashionable, while Pope Leo had made care for creation one of the central themes of his early pontificate. Here was common ground that transcended denominational differences. They discussed the challenges facing Christianity in the modern world: secularization, religious persecution, the struggle to remain relevant in an increasingly skeptical age. These were concerns that united Catholic and Anglican leaders alike. Both men had spent years grappling with how to present ancient truths to contemporary minds, how to make the gospel speak to a generation that often seemed indifferent to spiritual matters. But perhaps most importantly, they spoke about healing. Not just the healing of creation, but the healing of the wounds that had divided Christianity for centuries. Charles spoke of his vision of a church that could maintain its distinctive identity while working in partnership with other Christian traditions. Pope Leo shared his hope that the various branches of Christianity might find ways to work together on the great challenges facing humanity. The formal exchange of gifts came next, each present carefully chosen for its symbolic meaning. Charles presented the Pope with a silver-framed photograph of the royal family and an exquisite icon of St. Edward the Confessor, the Anglo-Saxon king who had been a model of Christian kingship. The icon had been specially commissioned from one of Britain's finest religious artists, its golden background and intricate details speaking of centuries of Christian devotion. Pope Leo, in return, gifted the king with a scale replica of the magnificent Christ Pantocrator mosaic from the Norman Cathedral of Cefalù in Sicily. The image of Christ as ruler of all was particularly appropriate. Both leaders recognized as they prepared to kneel together in prayer. They also exchanged autographed photographs, personal mementos of this unprecedented encounter. But the most significant exchange was yet to come: the conferring of honors that would bind their institutions together in new ways. The Pope made King Charles a Knight Grand Cross with collar of the Vatican Order of Pope Pius IX, one of the highest honors the Vatican could bestow. In return, Charles conferred upon the Pope the Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath, traditionally reserved for heads of state and the highest military commanders. Queen Camilla was made a Dame of the same Vatican order, her inclusion emphasizing the personal as well as institutional nature of this historic reconciliation. As these honors were exchanged, both leaders spoke of their hope that future generations would look back on this moment as a turning point in Christian history. The morning's formal meetings concluded with a shared sense that something profound had been accomplished. Two men who had inherited centuries of division had chosen instead the path of unity. They had shown that ancient enemies could become friends, that theological differences need not prevent cooperation, and that the gospel's call to love one another could transcend even the deepest institutional divides. Now came the moment that would capture the world's attention, the walk to the Sistine Chapel, where they would make history by praying together under the watchful eyes of Michelangelo's immortal masterpiece. Under Michelangelo's gaze, the walk to the Sistine Chapel felt like a pilgrimage through the ages. Pope Leo XIV and King Charles III moved side by side through corridors that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth of Renaissance art, and the great theological battles that had shaped Western civilization. Their footsteps echoed on marble floors polished by centuries of use, past frescoes that had inspired countless souls seeking the divine. As they approached the chapel, the weight of the moment began to settle on everyone present. This was no ordinary prayer service. This was the place where popes were elected, where Michelangelo had painted his vision of the Last Judgment, where the most solemn moments in Catholic life unfolded. And today, for the first time in nearly 500 years, the head of the Church of England would kneel beside the Bishop of Rome in worship. The Sistine Chapel doors opened to reveal a scene of breathtaking beauty and historical significance. The space, though not large by cathedral standards, seemed to expand infinitely upward toward Michelangelo's masterpiece ceiling. Every surface told a story of faith, struggle, and divine revelation. The famous frescoes of the creation, the fall, and the flood looked down upon the assembled dignitaries with their eternal gaze. Archbishop Stephen Cottrell, the Archbishop of York, was already waiting inside, his presence representing the Church of England's participation in this historic moment. Tall and scholarly, with a warm smile that put people at ease, Cottrell had worked tirelessly for years to build bridges between Anglican and Catholic communities. Today, his dream of meaningful dialogue was becoming reality in the most dramatic way possible. Queen Camilla entered with dignified grace, taking her place among the small but distinguished gathering. Her presence added a personal dimension to what could have been purely institutional theater. She had watched her husband struggle for years with the divisions between Christian churches, had seen his pain when religious differences prevented cooperation on urgent global issues. Today felt like a validation of his lifelong commitment to seeking unity in diversity. The choir arrangements were themselves a symbol of reconciliation. The Sistine Chapel Choir, perhaps the world's most prestigious Catholic musical ensemble, had prepared carefully for this moment. But they would not perform alone. They were joined by the choir of St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, and the choir of the Chapel Royal, both representing the finest traditions of Anglican church music. As the choirs took their positions, the visual symbolism was unmistakable. Catholic and Anglican voices would blend together in harmony, just as their leaders were about to blend their prayers. The musical directors had chosen pieces that honored both traditions. Thomas Tallis's If Ye Love Me, a jewel of English Renaissance music, will be performed alongside traditional Catholic chants that had echoed in this space for centuries. Pope Leo took his position at the small altar, while King Charles stood to his right, a placement carefully negotiated to show equality rather than hierarchy. Both men wore simple vestments appropriate to their roles, the Pope in white, symbolizing purity and peace, the King in ceremonial dress that honored the solemnity of the occasion without overwhelming its spiritual character. The moment of silence before the service seemed to stretch into eternity. 500 years of division, conflict, and misunderstanding hung in the air like an almost tangible presence. But there was something else in the silence, too. Hope, possibility, and the whispered prayers of countless believers who had longed for this day. When Pope Leo's voice finally broke the silence with, "Let us pray," the words seemed to carry the weight of centuries. They were not just beginning a religious service. They were closing a chapter of history and opening another. King Charles bowed his head in response, and in that simple gesture, the Protestant Reformation's rigid boundaries began to blur. The service focused on care for creation, a theme that united both leaders' deepest convictions. Pope Leo's opening prayer spoke of humanity's sacred duty to protect God's earth, while Archbishop Cottrell read from scripture passages that called believers to be stewards of creation. The choice of theme was brilliant. Environmental protection was a cause that transcended denominational lines, allowing Catholic and Anglican traditions to speak with one voice. When the choirs began to sing, the effect was transcendent. Centuries-old melodies filled the space where Michelangelo had painted his vision of divine judgment and mercy. The Anglican voices brought their tradition of crystal-clear diction and understated beauty, while the Catholic singers contributed the profound resonance of Gregorian chant. Together, they created something entirely new, a sound that honored both traditions while pointing toward a shared future. Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper, representing the British government, stood to read from St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Her voice was steady and clear as she proclaimed words that seemed written for this very moment. About the body of Christ having many members, about love being the greatest commandment, about the hope of glory that sustains believers through difficulty. The ancient words took on fresh meaning in this unprecedented context. Throughout the service, King Charles participated fully and naturally. When the congregation knelt, he knelt. When they stood, he stood. When they responded to prayers, his voice joined the chorus. There was no sense of him being an outsider participating in someone else's tradition. Instead, he seemed completely at home in the sacred space, as if recognizing that all Christian worship was ultimately directed toward the same divine source. The moment of shared communion was the most powerful of all. Though the king could not receive Catholic communion due to theological differences, both leaders participated in a blessing that transcended denominational boundaries. Pope Leo raised his hands over the assembled congregation, while King Charles joined in blessing the bread and wine that would nourish the faithful. It was a moment of unity within diversity, of shared purpose despite different practices. As Michelangelo's frescoes looked down upon the scene, it seemed as if the great artist's vision was being fulfilled in ways he could never have imagined. The same God who had inspired his brush to create immortal beauty was now inspiring two religious leaders to paint a new picture of Christian unity with their prayers and presence. When the service concluded, no one moved immediately. The weight of what had just occurred needed time to settle. History had been made not with grand pronouncements or dramatic gestures, but with the simple act of two Christians kneeling together before their Creator. The Reformation's wounds had not been completely healed, but they had been touched by grace in ways that opened new possibilities for the future. The silence that followed was pregnant with meaning, hope, and the sense that God's Spirit had moved in mighty ways within the sacred walls of the Sistine Chapel. The echo of eternity as the final notes of the anthem faded into the hallowed silence of the Sistine Chapel. King Charles III and Pope Leo XIV remained kneeling for several moments longer than protocol required. Neither man seemed eager to break the spell that had been woven by their unprecedented act of shared worship. Above them, Michelangelo's God reached out his finger toward Adam, a reminder that all of creation was connected by divine love, the same love that had brought these two leaders together after 5 centuries of separation. The world watched through carefully positioned cameras as the king and Pope finally rose, their faces reflecting the profound emotion of the moment. When their eyes met, something passed between them that transcended words, a recognition that they had just participated in something far greater than diplomacy or politics. They had touched the eternal, had stepped outside the bounds of human division into a space where only God's love mattered. Pope Leo spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the chapel's perfect acoustics. May this moment be a seed of peace for all God's children. King Charles nodded slowly, then replied with words that would be quoted in history books for generations. In kneeling together, we have stood up for what unites us rather than what divides us. The small congregation, carefully chosen church officials, government representatives, and select media began to file out of the chapel, but the two leaders lingered. They walked together toward the Sala Regia, the magnificent hall adjacent to the Sistine Chapel, where another phase of their historic encounter would unfold. Their conversation was private, but those who observed them noted an easy camaraderie that suggested genuine friendship was blossoming alongside institutional reconciliation. In the Sala Regia, with its stunning frescoes depicting the victory of Christian princes over their enemies, a different kind of victory was being celebrated. King Charles and Pope Leo met with business leaders, environmentalists, and activists who had gathered to discuss the care of creation. The irony was beautiful. In a room decorated with scenes of medieval religious warfare, modern religious leaders were plotting cooperation to save God's earth. The conversation that followed was animated and hopeful. Charles spoke passionately about his decades of environmental advocacy, while Pope Leo shared his vision of ecological conversion as a spiritual necessity. Together, they outlined plans for Catholic-Anglican cooperation on climate change initiatives, refugee assistance, and poverty reduction programs. The practical fruits of their prayer were already beginning to emerge. Queen Camilla, meanwhile, had been moved to tears during the chapel service. Those close to her noted that she seemed to understand better than anyone the personal significance of this moment for her husband. She had watched him struggle for years with the rigid boundaries between Christian traditions, had seen his frustration when theological differences prevented cooperation on urgent human needs. Today, those boundaries were beginning to dissolve. The journey from the Vatican to the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls provided a brief respite for reflection. As their motorcade wound through Rome's ancient streets, past ruins that had witnessed the birth of Christianity and the rise of papal power, both leaders contemplated what they had just accomplished. The weight of history was no longer a burden. It had become a foundation for building something new. St. Paul's Basilica, one of the 4 papal basilicas of Rome, held special significance for this visit. Unlike St. Peter's, which was purely Catholic space, St. Paul's had historical connections to English Christianity that made it the perfect venue for the next phase of reconciliation. Saxon kings had contributed to the maintenance of St. Paul's tomb in centuries past, creating a bond between England and this sacred site that predated the Reformation. The basilica's soaring interior provided a majestic setting for the final ceremony of the day. Here, King Charles would be formally recognized as Royal Confrater of the Basilica, a title that symbolically restored the ancient connection between the English monarchy and this sacred Roman site. It was not a religious conversion or institutional merger, but rather a gesture of friendship that honored shared history while pointing toward a shared future. Cardinal James Harvey, the American archbishop who served as the basilica's leader, performed the ceremony with evident emotion. A specially commissioned chair bearing the royal coat of arms and the Latin inscription Ut Unum Sint, that they may be one, was unveiled and blessed. This chair would remain permanently in the basilica, awaiting future visits by British monarchs and serving as a symbol of the new relationship between Canterbury and Rome. As King Charles took his seat in the chair for the first time, the symbolism was overwhelming. Here was a Protestant monarch sitting in honor in a Catholic basilica, blessed by a pope, welcomed by cardinals, and celebrated by believers from both traditions. The chair itself would become a pilgrimage destination for those who believed in Christian unity. The service that followed was ecumenical in the truest sense. Anglican and Catholic clergy participated together, their voices joining in prayers that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier. The tomb of St. Paul, the apostle who had written so eloquently about the unity of the body of Christ, seemed to bless this new chapter in Christian history. When the ceremonies concluded and the royal couple prepared to depart Rome, both King Charles and Pope Leo seemed reluctant to see the day end. Their final conversation was private, but witnesses noted warm embraces and promises to continue the dialogue they had begun. Plans were already being discussed for future meetings, joint initiatives, and shared programs that would give practical expression to the spiritual unity they had celebrated. The flight back to London provided time for the king and Queen to process what they had experienced. Charles stared out the window at the lights of Europe passing below, reflecting on how a simple act of prayer had opened doors that had been sealed for centuries. The boy who had dreamed of being a bridge between faiths had become the man who actually built one. Queen Camilla took her husband's hand as they flew through the night sky. No words were necessary. They both understood that they had been part of something larger than themselves. The ancient wounds of Christianity had not been completely healed in a single day, but they had been touched by grace in ways that made healing possible. Back in the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV knelt in his private chapel for his evening prayers. The events of the day played through his mind like scenes from a beautiful dream. He had inherited the papacy during a time of division and discord, but today he had planted seeds of unity that might flourish for generations. The prayer he offered was simple but profound. Thank you, Lord, for letting me be part of your healing work. The newspapers and television stations of the world would spend days analyzing every gesture, every word, every symbol of this historic encounter. Theologians would debate its significance, politicians would assess its implications, and historians would argue about its place in the grand narrative of Christian civilization. But perhaps the most important response came from ordinary believers around the world who saw in this moment a sign of hope. In an age of division and conflict, two religious leaders had shown that ancient enemies could become friends, that theological differences need not prevent cooperation, and that the love of God was stronger than human stubbornness. The echo of their prayers in the Sistine Chapel would reverberate through history, a reminder that faith at its best was not about building walls, but about tearing them down. 500 years after Henry VIII broke with Rome, his successor had chosen not conquest, but reconciliation, not division, but unity, not war, but peace. And in the space between their kneeling figures, bathed in the light of Michelangelo's vision of divine love, the future of Christianity had been subtly, but irrevocably changed. The king and the pope had prayed together, and in their prayer, they had discovered that they were no longer strangers, but brothers in the faith that transcends all human boundaries.